Concord is the biggest commercial video game failure I have seen in quite a while, perhaps ever. I mean, Sony was so excited about this game that they signed an exclusivity contract with Firewalk Studios before buying the developers outright for this game. And while the purchase price isn't public information, it wasn't like Sony was picking up a huge back catalogue of successful games in the process. This was their first game, and it was an abject failure. I mean, this game was live for just 11 days before it was taken down. They had major ambitions for this game, so much so that internally they were referring to this game as a Star Wars-like project. And while this game is currently down, I don't think they're out. I think they're coming back. To put this game's failure into perspective, Concord held 2 3-day betas, but to be honest, they were so late into the game's development cycle that they were basically just demos. The first was a closed beta, available to everybody who had pre-purchased the game, and 5 of their friends. That's right, they were giving away 5 beta keys with every purchase of the game. But those sales numbers obviously weren't high enough for the execs, and so days before the beta, Sony announced that the game would also be available to PlayStation Plus Extra subscribers, the PS equivalent to the Xbox Game Pass. Now, it's important to remember, and so I'm going to keep repeating it, that we don't know exact figures because the game was also available on the PlayStation, but the Steam figures give us a good yardstick to measure by. And so, on the 12th of July, for the first ever time, Concord was available to the wider public. A Star Wars-like project, their magnus opus. So, what were their numbers? 5,000? 10,000? No. They achieved a peak of 1,124 concurrent players. And unfortunately, this wasn't a false start either, with the player count falling on the following days to 933 and 630 players respectively. Now, while the reception was generally mixed, these weren't all the players, but it's safe to assume that PlayStation mirrored the PC trends. But hey, that one was a closed beta. It was on a weekday. The next beta was on the 18th of July, a weekend. It was an open beta. It was free. So surely the players would flock to this, right? Surely what went wrong last time was that they just didn't have the time, right? And so, on the 18th of July, we saw a record high of 2,388 players. Never again would the servers be so strained. And unfortunately for Concord, the player count continued to fall in the following days, reaching peaks of a measly 2,103 and 1,535 players. Again, it's worth noting that this isn't all the players, but it certainly isn't looking good. However, despite the low player count, Sony did not blink. They were all in. They weren't backing down, or at least that's what they were telling us, promising at least 3 seasons worth of content, with the game director Ryan Ellis posting on the PlayStation blog store that Season 1 would introduce a cosmetic store, and that, quote, these will supplement the hundreds of rewards earnable through progressions, and will be solely cosmetic, optional, and have no gameplay impact. They never did keep this promise. So, despite the lackluster reception of the beta, Sony was still going full steam ahead. This game wasn't going anywhere. Concord was here, and it was here to stay. But time moves forever onwards, and launch day was fast approaching. It was time to show the world, to grip the 5v5 hero shooter player base by the balls and not let go, to put Blizzard out of business. And this Star Wars-like project launched to a whopping peak of 697 players on Steam. I need you to remember as well that this number would also include journalists and content creators who would be rushing to get that first video out. To give you an idea of just how bad these numbers are, the day before, a certified scammer of a game whose devs were more interested in making a Zoom clone than a game, who recently returned from the rock they've been hiding under to ask for a second chance, launched to a peak of 38,000 players. But if you want to learn more about that situation, you can check out my video on the topic. Well, that game had a lot of hype around it. Let's find some more examples. Concord had less than half the players of Redfall. It had a lower player count than Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. I mean, it had less players than Gollum. Now, again, these aren't all the players by any means, but it still isn't great. Then, on the 3rd of September, just 8 days after launch, Ryan took to the PlayStation blog once again to announce that the servers would be closing on the 6th of September, and that everybody who had purchased the game would be getting a direct refund. Ironically, this is one of the few times in the game's history that the player count went up from the previous day. You see, this led to an interesting situation where players were throwing themselves from cliffs to gain more XP for the PlayStation Platinum Trophy. And I am proud to stand before you today to announce that there are 60 such individuals who achieved this glorious result. Ironically enough, these brave soldiers may hold the rarest trophy in gaming history. So, with the player count peaking for the final time on the 6th of September, and the servers straining to uphold those final 52 players, they collapsed. Good night, sweet prince. This, of course, led to the value of the game keys spiking on the grey market as people rushed to collect their limited time JPEG. Interestingly, while Sony didn't make any mention of this, PlayStation users have reported that the game was vanishing from their system once they got their refunds. So, Concord was live for 11 days, a game created by employees who had worked on the biggest games on the industry, people who had worked on COD, people who had worked on Destiny, a game that had 8 years of development. 8 years. A studio with around 150 employees. A game that has an estimated budget of $100 million. Now, while that is an unconfirmed number, and I couldn't find its origin, it has been repeated by Forbes, but it's a bit more complicated, and we'll get into that later. What we do know is that reports state that this game only managed to sell 25,000 units in total, 10k on Steam, ranking it as the 347th best-selling game in August, and the other 15,000 on PlayStation. To put those figures into perspective, Astro Boy sold more physical copies in the UK alone than Concord sold total worldwide. While Sony has been engaging in regional pricing, the price was fluctuating around the £30 mark, so we can estimate the rough earnings to be around £750,000, or just under $1 million, which they didn't keep anyways because they returned all the money. So, this raises one question, one key question. What went wrong? A theme that's going to appear again and again is that the game is technically brilliant, but makes so many odd design decisions that it shot itself in the foot. I mean, you would think that a game that was live for a mere 11 days must surely have been terrible. I hesitate to call it Flash games because they have far longer lifespans, but surprisingly, it's not. The game is serviceable. This isn't a Gollum situation, which makes it all the more confusing about why it collapsed. Now, a quick disclosure, I didn't play this game because 1, I ain't coughing up £30 for it, and 2, I only learnt about this train wreck when it was on its way out. So I'll be taking my opinions from the gameplay I've watched and the reviews I've consumed, in particular Skillup's multiple videos on the topic and the multiple articles by IGN, linked down in the description below. So the game opens up to this pre-rendered cutscene, and while we'll talk about character design later, the models look great. The animations are smooth, and I mean, few games have this level of facial capture even in the cutscenes. It is exceptionally well done. The voice acting is well done, which makes it all the more impressive that this animation wasn't just a once-off. They were planning on producing a 2-minute cinematic of this quality every week. Obviously, this is wildly unsustainable. I mean, these cinematics are expensive. There is a reason why every other multi-million-dollar game isn't churning them out. And while they've had 8 years to build up a catalogue, that number is finite and they're going to run out. Are they really going to be able to produce 52 of these a year? Absolutely not. That being said, while the animation is well done, the writing could be better. It feels zany. It feels like they were trying to pull on the same heartstrings as Guardians of the Galaxy, but failed to do so. But hey, Maybe the writing would have gotten more compelling as the animations unfolded, as I got more invested into these characters. But that is a question we might never know the answer to. Putting aside the issue of them being able to physically produce that much content, would it even be able to sustain a player base that pipettes worth of content every week? I don't know if you can build any traction with that. But that wasn't the only lore to the game. They produce a surprisingly large amount of written lore in the form of this galaxy-wide map and its planetary details. Unfortunately, it is all rather bland world building, but it was a base for something to be built on. But you don't really need to know about any of the lore for this video. All that you need to know is that they're space pirates. There's often a large difference between the quality of a pre-rendered cutscene and one of actual gameplay. I mean, you don't need to look any further than World of Warcraft. But the models hold up. They carry that same level of execution into the game. The same can also be said for the environment. They've done very well to make it look crisp. As well it should be, with the game being built in the Unreal 5 engine. The same engine as Black Myth Wukong. The same engine that's going to be behind the new Halo game. While they don't take full advantage of the system, with the game missing features like Lumen, it doesn't look bad. It is a technically well done game. Keeping to that technically well done theme, you can tell this game's pedigree. It thrives in the moment-to-moment gameplay. The controls feel tight, it's not floaty, it has a good skeleton. At the end of the day, this is a hero shooter. So what about those heroes, those pirates, free runners? Well, to be fair, their playstyles are wide-ranging and play rather uniquely. We have Catgirl Sombra, we have Junkrat Mushroom Man, the Warlock from Destiny, the compulsory first-person shooter, and the devs even managed to come up with some novel ideas, like the Roomba here, who can suck up enemies' kits. You might be sat there scratching your head, thinking this can't be correct. I mean, this game crashed and burned, and yet you're sat here singing its praises. What's wrong with it? Creatively, it's dull. It's not enough to simply provide a palatable experience anymore. We're not in 2016. The hero shooter market has matured. There's plenty of competition, each offering its own spin on the genre. A great example of this is that the free runners don't have any ultimates, which means there's no decisive turnaround, there's no holy shit moment. And while the obvious counter to this is that it makes the game more competitive, more tactical, and skill-based, something along the lines of CSGO or Siege, but they don't lean into it enough, and it just ends up being dull. I mean, look at the maps. The game launched with 12, and I stand by what I said. They are well done, but they lack any charm. There's no uniqueness. There's nothing different. They are so clearly built to be competitive that they have no flair, no soul. They painted themselves as this space pirate team shooter, and yet they make no use of this aesthetic, of this lore. Each map is barely anything more than a utilitarian shooter map. There's no unique map mechanics. It's just dull. The game modes are barely any better. There are 6 different modes, but they are all basically different versions of zone control or deathmatch. Now, that's fine. It's a bit dull, but it's fine. It does have a competitive mode called Rivalry, but we'll get into that later. The important thing to remember is that generally, the game has 2 modes, one where you respawn and one where you don't. And that's the issue. It has all these systems which should only apply to one or the other, but they don't. They apply to both, and it just makes it terrible. Let's talk about crew systems. So the game has 6 classes: Anchor, Breacher, Haunt, Tactician, Ranger, and Warden, with each of these classes giving a crew bonus, i.e. movement speed, that carries to the end of the game. Now, you would be forgiven for thinking that your team is your crew, but no, you are your crew, specifically your player roster. Now, while I'm not a fan of being forced to play characters in a specific order to create my super character, it is a new and different mechanic, and that makes sense in modes where you don't respawn, where everyone chooses their free runner at the same time, like in Rivalry. It doesn't make sense in modes where you respawn, where people are constantly switching their characters and throwing themselves off cliffs, trying to build to get that bonus for the character they actually want to play. Team balancing is hard enough as it is without people constantly switching faster than you can keep up. It also doesn't help that the game has an incredibly short respawn timer. The characters are not organised in groups or marked in any particular way, so you have to memorise what each Freerunner's class is and hope that you beat the QuickTime event to not grief your team. It's not like you can check the character's information either because the timer is so goddamn fast. Well, at least everyone is working with the same crew system, so a meta will rise from the player's zeitgeist from optional rotation, and I don't really have to think about it. Well, allow me to introduce you to another dumb system, the crew card minigame. Before you actually get into the game, you have to pre-select what characters you want to use in-game, with the game itself encouraging you to build different crews for different circumstances. Why? Now, you may see the same character twice. Well, to understand that, we have to go back to Rivalry mode, a mode where you choose the characters to play at the same time. Think Rainbow Six Siege. But if you win the round, that character gets locked out, meaning the only way you can use your favourite character is a variant. A variant is a hero with a different passive. That's it. So we have Junkrat Mushroom Man 1, who has the passive to drop spores on an enemy kill, but Junkrat Mushroom Man 2 can fire faster standing on these spores. Again, it's understandable. It's not good by any means, but understandable for Rivalry, except this system applies to the whole game. Why is this card system here at all? Bin it. It's terrible. Just use a loadout system like every other game. This is all too much. It is a heavy-handed attempt to get players to use a wider array of characters rather than just hard focusing on one. They've added all these needlessly obtuse systems into the game. It feels schizophrenic. It feels like they had two competing visions for this game. One where it was the next hyper-competitive esport, and one where it was more casual, something between Overwatch and Valorant. But in trying to appeal to both, they found no one wanted to fight through these bloated and complex systems to get to their game. But now, let's talk about the aspect that got this game into the most trouble. The issue that lots of people seem to think is the reason why this game failed. An issue which, while bad, isn't as bad as people make out to be. The elephant in the room.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
A general rule of thumb is that you want to be able to tell who a character is from the silhouette. A great example of this is Overwatch. For as much hate as Blizzard gets about their game, their character design team knocks it out of the park every single time. Their silhouettes are iconic. You can show someone who has some gaming knowledge but doesn't know anything about Overwatch, and I bet they could probably guess Rhino or Tracer. But these heroes, these freerunners, are just bland. They have this 90s disco space pirate theme, and the character designs are just dull. There is one interesting character I like. It gets the idea of its kit across in its design, but the others, I mean, come on. You have a man in a parka, generic human, old lady, generic human, cat girl, generic human. I mean, it's just so dull and boring. Let's have a quick conversation about design language. Okay, so common culture and gaming in particular have a design language which doesn't always map onto reality. A great example of this is that big muscular people can't be fast. And all I ask is that you watch a game of rugby. So let's say you're thinking about a tank, someone who's big, someone who's wearing armour, think Reinhardt from Overwatch, and they do play into this. So the Roomba screams tank to me, a big, imposing character, and that's what he is, with all of his abilities being trash-related. Very good, very on theme. Even the build-your-own Space Marine character looks like a tank. I may not like the design, I may think it's tasteless, but it looks like a tank. Now, let's have a look at the man in the parka. What type of character archetype do you think he is? He's very large, so maybe a big tank. And to be fair, he does have this apex bubble, but the rest of his kit is focused around healing. Nothing about this character looks like a healer. Nothing about this character even hints towards its possibility. He isn't even the worst one. Take a look at this. She is supposed to be a demolitions expert. Her kit consists of her flying across the air with thrusters and blasts into the ground. But look at her. Nothing about this design even suggests she can do any of that. She has a rocket launcher, and that's it. Okay, one last one. There's this space cat girl, which is supposed to be a Sombra analog. Her kit is very similar. She can teleport and disrupt enemies' abilities. Nothing about this design suggests any of that. It's just so odd. These designs are incredibly well technically executed. They are incredibly detailed, but the ideas behind them are just so lacking. You may be thinking, oh, that's just the base skin tones. You have to play for 50 hours to unlock the cool ones. And while that might be true in later seasons, all the extras that were launched with the game are dull, they're boring. They mainly consist of reskins, which somehow make the character look worse. And yet there is an absolutely zero chance that they will change any of these designs. They've spent far too much money on those animations. They are pot committed. They ain't going anywhere. Now, as I said at the start, people are laying the sole reason that this game failed on its design. And while they are bad, people could have looked past them if the rest of the game was great. I mean, look at Siege. The character design in that game are all based around the special operatives motifs. And while there are a couple characters I might be able to pick up from a lineup at a push, like the Robot or Clash, I don't expect someone who mains Rook or Castle to have picked those characters because of their design. If it was just that one creative issue, sure, they might have had monetization issues going forward, trying to sell skins for these characters, but they could have made it. All these creative issues stack on top of each other, compounding each other. And yet, despite all these creative issues, the game is still passable. The game could have made it, but the executive failures are even more egregious. I want you to remember the best meal that you have ever had at a restaurant, the one that you dream about, the one that you salivate about, the one that when someone asks you what your favourite meal was, it comes to the forefront of your mind. Now, how many times have you been there? Once? Twice? And yet the best performing restaurant in the world isn't a Gordon Ramsay chain. It's McDonald's. And I'm willing to bet that you've been to Mackie D's more times than that restaurant that you pictured in your mind. Why? It's cheap. It's easy. It's available. This idea of resistance is relevant to every business genre there is. It's the reason why almost all big hero shooters are free to play. It's the reason that when Overwatch 2 launched, it launched free to play despite the original requiring a purchase. The only exception I can think of being Siege, but that game is almost a decade old. The free-to-play model is almost required for new IP hero shooters to succeed at this point. I mean, look, it's no surprise that publishers are looking for live service hero shooters. They make obscene amounts of money. I mean, truly eye-watering amounts. Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the best games I have ever played, and in 2023, it made $657 million on Steam alone. But people will buy that game once, and there is no story locked behind a microtransaction, and I really do respect them for that. And that game deserves all the accolades it can get its hands on. They will never have another year as big. The lifetime earnings for Apex Legends is $3.4 billion. This is the field that Concord chose to compete in, a hyper-competitive market where it is already hard enough to drag one player, much less their friends, from another game that they have already spent so much time and money on. It makes that £35 price tag all the harder to follow. Again, this price might have been acceptable 8 years ago, but the market has matured. Another of the key reasons that all these games are free is because of something called the network effect. The idea is that in multiplayer games, the more players there are, the more enjoyable and engaging the game becomes for each individual. This is because not only can players find matches more quickly, those matches are more fun because the skill of the opponents and the teammates are closer to the user's level. It's why having large and active player bases are so important for these types of games. Now, there are two reasons why I can think they chose this price tag. The first is that Concord was following on the coattails of Helldivers 2. That game was incredibly successful, so much so that they almost had 500,000 active users on at the same time, while having a £35 price tag and being a live service game. So perhaps the execs simply thought that this game could replicate that success, and that they would be able to double dip. The second reason is related to the first, and that is the idea of toxic positivity. This originates from the Sacred Symbols podcast, in particular an ex-IGN journalist called Colin Moriarty, who spoke to someone who worked on Concord and confirmed that he did so. That individual said the game had been internally referred to as the future of PlayStation, with Star Wars-like potential. and a dev culture of toxic positivity halting any negative feedback. Not only has this idea been mirrored by other journalists, it does kind of make sense with PlayStation cancelling 6 of its promised 12 live service games. They desperately did not want this one to fail. It also doesn't help that Concord is banned in 117 different countries. But if you want to learn more about why they do that, then you can watch my video about Helldivers. We've seen people guess about the price that it took to develop this game. I mean, as I said earlier, Forbes were running with a story that there were unconfirmed reports that the game cost $100 million. But in that previous clip, they say something very interesting.
Is that Concord cost about $400 million to make.
They claim that Firewalk had spent $200 million before being purchased by Sony, only for Sony to see how underdeveloped the game was, with them having no player onboarding or monetization, and so Sony needed to spend an extra $200 million in outsourcing to get the game up to scratch. There is no chance that it cost that much. There have been experts in the industry speaking out against this price tag, and I tend to agree. To give you some understanding of that price tag, Spider-Man 2 ran over budget, and that game cost $300 million. So, where are these numbers coming from? Well, we need to talk about a company called Probably Monsters and how it makes its money. You see, they are a venture capitalist-backed studio. The studio was originally founded back in 2016, and while we don't know how they got their initial investment, we do know that they got a round of seed funding in 2019 to the tune of $18 million. Then, in 2022, their Series A funding raised an additional $250 million. But what do they do with all that money? Well, they spin up pre-development and incubation teams like Cauldron, Battle Barge, Hidden Grove, and Firewalk to do pre-production in the hopes that they'll be able to get a publishing deal to pay for full production of the game. This is why, although Firewalk Studios only started in 2018, the idea of Concord is even younger. This is why you see this 8 years of development figure being thrown around, which is technically true, but it's not a full staff. This is the same thing that happened with Starfield. People thought they were getting a Bethesda game that had been in full development for 8 years, when in reality it had only been in full development for 3. Anyways, back to Concord. Firewalk announced their partnership with PlayStation in 2021. With the additional funding, the team ballooned in size to the upper double digits, and so Sony bought them a new building. But then the COVID bubble popped. Cauldron's game was cancelled, Hidden Grove was supposed to have a closed alpha in the summer, and either nothing has been leaked, or the project was suspended, and while Battle Barge is still going along with their co-op RPG, only time will tell if it will ever get released. Quick update, the Battle Barge project is still going on, but they've fired 50 people. This is to say nothing about any of the other incubation teams that Probably Monsters have working in the background. And while I want to give you more information about that, this section of the website is greyed out. Another update, that part of the website has now been removed. At the end of the day, this is a venture capitalist-backed firm. They want a return on their investment. So, when Sony approaches them about purchasing the studio, they jump at the bit. But why did Sony buy them? They already have a publishing deal. Why do they want more? Well, with a publishing deal, they don't have any control over the game's development. A similar situation happened with Deviation Games, and they got burnt. They thought by acquiring the studio, they could prevent it from happening again. And while there was certainly outsourcing after the acquisition, this is not uncommon in the games industry. So, that $400 million figure comes from a large amount of the Series A funding going directly to Firewalk, which I simply think isn't the case. It was split up amongst Probably Monsters' many projects. With regards to that extra $200 million coming from Sony, well, it can't be shown in any meaningful way. It's simply not public. We have an update to the situation. Kotaku are now running with the story that Sony did spend $200 million in the initial deal, as confirmed by 2 unnamed sources. When I started writing the script for this video, my guess about this game coming back would have either made me seem like a raving lunatic or a prophet of Notre Dame. I had nothing to go on except the thought that they were pot committed, I thought the IP was salvageable, and vibes. But I've taken so long that it is now all but confirmed, and I would put the odds at nearly 100%. It's very clear to me that this game is being worked on. To what end? It has to be a re-release. It makes the most sense. I mean, it's one thing to see the SteamDB player count tick up off 0 every once in a while. It's another thing to see the game getting active updates. If this game was dead, really dead, the day before Levels of Dead, why are they updating the game? I think it's coming back. Not only are they updating the game, they've also added a clause to the user agreement. In particular, they added a seizure warning, asking players to consult a doctor before playing the game if they have pre-existing conditions, which is surprising for two reasons. The first, it's amazing to me that this wasn't already included in the game. I mean, every other game you open, it feels like the first thing you see is a seizure warning from the devs desperately asking you, please don't sue us. Secondly, this all but confirms to me that this game will go live again. Why would you update a user agreement if it wasn't going to go back in front of users? Now, this raises the interesting question of when. And while this is complete conjecture, and I have absolutely no proof for what I'm about to say, I would guess it would be around the 10th of December 2024. Why? Well, let's talk about the final reason I think this game failed. Marketing. I did not hear about this game until it was on its way out. And while sure, they did post those short animations to the PlayStation channel with 1.4 million subs, it didn't get much traction compared to Blizzard. When they put out their character cinematics, they won awards for best writing in film and video. But they do have one final bullet in the chamber before they have to spend a lot of cash to reload their gun. Secret Level, an Amazon TV production where each episode focuses on a story from the gaming franchise. Think Love, Death, Robots, but just for games. And somehow, Concord managed to get their game up there with the likes of Outer Worlds and Warhammer, with the release date of Secret Level being the 10th of December. This raises an interesting question. Will the initial failure of this game be better for its long-term health? I would be incredibly surprised if this game did not launch in a free-to-play state. When that happens, it will generate an incredible amount of press, in doing so driving the player count up with its low barrier to entry and players wanting to see if the game was really that bad. It's not like we haven't seen games in the past have disastrous launches only later to capture the hearts of players. No Man's Sky had a truly terrible launch, reaching overwhelmingly negative reviews in the Steam store before climbing its way back up. Final Fantasy XIV launched in such poor condition that Square Enix shut down the game servers before rebuilding the game as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. But these are exceptional cases, not the rule. Only time will tell if Concord will rise from the ashes or if it's just another Morbius re-release. So I was wrong. I was mega wrong. I was the most wrong you could possibly be. So just ignore everything I said about this game coming back, because holy shit did I miss the mark. While I was doing the final touches on this video, the PlayStation CEO has come out and announced that Firewalk Studios will be closed down alongside another studio called Neon Koei. These shutdowns are estimated to affect 210 jobs according to one Bloomberg report. The reason the CEO gives is a pretty obvious one. It didn't hit Sony's targets. We have spent considerable time these past few months exploring all our options. After much thought, we have determined the best path forward is to permanently sunset the game and close the studio. I want to thank all of Firewalk for their craftsmanship, creative spirit, and dedication, end quote. Firewalk also put out a statement about their studio being sunsetted on Twitter, which takes an odd tone. Usually these statements are an apology saying how sorry they are about how they've disappointed the fans and the player base. Just another post to add to the wall. But this one is different. It's almost self-indulgent, saying how incredible their team was. One example is talking about how they, quote, built a new customized next-generation FPS engine in Unreal 4 to 5, end quote. I can respect them for that, because I think it takes real balls to put in the closing statement of your studio, quote, please reach out to recruiting at PlayStation for inquiries. That's certainly a new one, but you've got to get that job application in early. Either way, this is the end of the Concord situation, and while it isn't everything, like we didn't talk about how the game director self-demoted, you have the important bits. If you've enjoyed this video, why not hit that like and subscribe button for more? I do hope the next one will be out sooner. Either way, bye.